Okay, well, while we're getting the slides up, I will take this opportunity to welcome you all to UCL. It's wonderful to see so many of you here this evening. I'm Professor Courtney Norbury, and I am chairing this evening's event. And I'm really delighted to have a panel of experts of a much wider age range than we're usually used to here at UCL. And it's really great to see all of you here this evening. So hopefully we're going to have some slides in a minute and I will tell you what will happen. But I guess we'll go ahead and we'll introduce the panel to start with. So Essie, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves since we don't have our slides. You can see pictures of them in a minute. So Essie Weiding.
I'm Essie Weiding. I'm Essie Weiding. I am the Pro-Vice Provost for Mental Health and Wellbeing Grand Challenge here at UCL, together with a colleague of mine who will introduce himself shortly. I'm also a professor in Division of Psychology and Language Sciences, and I research children and young people's mental health problems.
Hi everyone, my name is Georgina Krebs. I'm an associate professor in young people's mental health here at UCL, and I'm also a clinical psychologist. So I'm interested in mental health in young people in general, but particularly emotional disorders, anxiety and depression, and within that, particularly obsessive compulsive and related problems.
Thank you. I'm Agust Stringaris. I'm a professor of child and adolescent psychiatry here at UCL, and you heard the slightly ecclesiastical title before, Pro-Vice Provost, which means working together with Professor Weiding on bringing together all the mental health science, mental health related and well-being science that is happening at UCL at the moment, and you'll hear some very exciting examples of it tonight.
Hello, I'm Alexandra Pittman. I'm a professor of psychiatry here at UCL, and I work as a consultant psychiatrist in our neighbouring mental health trust, North London Foundation Trust. And I'm interested in researching suicide risk, self-harm and loneliness and the links between all of those in young people, but also across the whole life course.
I'm Tilly Hewitt and I'm part of the, would it be the Young People's Board, I think? Yeah.
I'm Juliet. I'm also part of the Young People's Board.
Hi, I'm Evie and I'm also part of the Young People's Board.
Hi, I'm Susie. And I'm a young person with DLD.
Hi, I'm Rachel and I'm Susie's mum and I am her advocate as well, and that's why I'm here tonight.
Thank you so much. So it's really great to have a range of expertise. So we have people who've devoted their lives to studying the causes and consequences of mental health disorders in young people and how to best solve them. And then young people who are really essential to telling us whether our ideas have any legs and what will work for them. So it's good to have both perspectives. I have to tell you some housekeeping rules. One is where to find the toilets. If you need them, you just go out the doors at the back and they're straight ahead, and some downstairs. We're not expecting a fire alarm. So if you hear the fire alarm, we need to exit the building through the doors at the back. And one at the side too. So if you're on the bottom row, go out that door. It's very important. Please keep your phones on silent. In your registration pack, you should have instructions for Slido, or you can go to slido.com and add the hashtag Know Yourself. And you'll be able to post questions, and there will be an opportunity for us to ask those questions at the end. Now, we have people with a range of experiences here this evening. Your experience might be different to someone else's, and that's fine. We need to be very respectful. We also have individuals here who have varying language and communication challenges. So I'm going to try and ask people to keep their answers brief and to speak slowly so that we've all got time to process some different ideas and think about how it affects us and any questions we might want to ask. If we have the next slide, please. Just run through them. Okay, so we've done the introductions. What we're going to do now is invite our youth panel to ask questions of our older expert panel. They've thought about these questions, and we've also asked people from schools to submit questions. So we have some questions already in the bag. We're going to run through those. And then after 45 minutes to an hour, we'll come to Slido and ask some of those questions. And at the end of that, there will be some refreshments outside. You can meet and talk to each other and enjoy the evening. So now I'm going to run through all of this because we've met each other. And I'm going to start now with the first question. So Tilly has very bravely volunteered to ask the first question. Tilly, over to you.
My first question is, how has the stigma around the mental health of children and young people changed over time, and are there still specific conditions that face greater stigma?
So which of our panel members are keen to tackle that one first?
It sounds like you believe that I am the oldest and will have the broad perspective on it. But it's an excellent question. And when I started, I actually was doing neurology before I came to child psychiatry and child psychiatry, and no one was talking about a child mental illness at the time in the public, or very, very few people. So one of the things that I was told was, are you sure going to do this job? Because there's not going to be much public interest ever in this, because it's a taboo matter. And also, you know, the funders, the people who give us the money to do the research, they won't be particularly interested. And they did say that the last person who had gotten money to do research in child psychiatry was quite many years back. So obviously this has changed quite dramatically, right? And now everyone seems to be very interested in child and adolescents, mental health and well-being, and that is really great. People are very interested in depression and anxiety, primarily, I would say. People are very interested in autism and neurodevelopmental conditions or neurodivergence. People are less interested in what we would call disruptive behavior disorders. So those children and young people whose behavior is not necessarily conforming to that of society. So people, we call them naughty or positional, people with conduct, young people with conduct problems, as is the terminology. So those people are very hard to bring to the public's attention, despite the fact that they do suffer a lot themselves. Very often they have very suffering histories behind them. Very often they cause suffering to others, which is very important, and problems to society. So I think if there is still kind of stigma, if there are people whom we don't talk much about, these would be the first people who come to mind. So it's very hard to go to a charity and say, well, I know you're giving money to childhood cancer, but how about you give money for very naughty children? Try it, it's actually quite hard. Yet, doesn't make much sense.
That's an excellent answer. Thanks, Argyris. Would anyone else like to offer a thought on that one?
Well, I very much second that, doing research into disruptive behavior disorders myself, and I know how hard it is to get funding for that. I also know that we have a panel member here with developmental language disorder. This is a condition that is often associated with elevated risk of mental health problems. Perhaps unsurprising if you find it difficult to communicate. Well, it is a more difficult place to navigate. And again, mental health problems for children with DLD have not received a huge amount of attention, even though these children are overrepresented in mental health services and also in criminal justice services. So I think there are groups of individuals who haven't been able to advocate for themselves, or who haven't had parents who've been able to advocate for them, and these are currently not receiving the attention that we are affording to children with perhaps more common conditions such as depression or anxiety.
Thank you. I couldn't agree with that more. Evie, you're going to have a follow-on question from that. And yes, if you could use the microphone, that would be great. And use your biggest voice if you can. That's brilliant. So just to, because I think your microphone's not working. So the question is, reducing stigma is a great thing, but maybe we've swung too far the other way, and that some conditions are seem to be quite glamorous. So what does the panel think about the glamorization of some aspects of mental health? Georgina, do you want to jump in with a first answer to that?
Yeah, sure. I think I would agree with that statement, at least for some conditions. So I think there are several problems that can occur when perhaps there's too much discourse, too much conversation around particular problems. One is that they can be a little bit diluted in their representation and sometimes be a bit trivialized. So my background is working with OCD, and you often hear people now saying, I'm so OCD. They sort of use it as a description about their personality, and perhaps actually what they mean is that they like things tidy or that they're very organized. And the sort of downside of that is that for the person who really is suffering from OCD that gets in the way of their life and causes a lot of distress and impairment, that can seem really invalidating and trivialize the problems that they're experiencing. And that's something I often hear from clients that I work with. I think another problem is, which Argyris might want to speak more about, is that sometimes with sort of increased awareness, people might over-identify with having a certain problem. So they might start to think, oh yes, that sounds a bit like me, I do have OCD, or I do have anxiety, I do have depression. And if they're over-identifying, there could be some downsides of that. It could impact on their self-concept, it could impact on decisions they make, and choices they make, particularly during adolescence, which is such a crucial phase of development. And some of those impacts could actually have the sort of paradoxical effect of increasing their risk. This is a hypothesis, it hasn't been fully tested yet, but that's an idea that I think we need to consider. And then I think the third potential problem is that if people do start to over-identify and think, yes, I do have anxiety, I do have depression, because they're experiencing transient stress or low mood, they might start to seek help and attend services, which would be a reasonable thing to do, but that may then clog up the system. We know that child and adolescent mental health services are really struggling. The referral rates have doubled over the pandemic, and people who are at the sort of severe end of the continuum of symptoms are really struggling to access the help that they need. So I think we need to sort of bear all of those things in mind.
Thank you, Georgina. We're going to come back to that issue of very long waiting lists and issues around getting support. But I think that's a really brilliant way into that. And also into questions that I can see on Slido, and the next question, which is about alternative sources of help and the role of the social media and online support groups. So this particular question says, do you think that mental health online support groups or platforms help or hinder real-world discussion about mental health? And Alexandra, I might bring you in because we haven't heard from you yet. What are your thoughts on kind of seeking help online?
Shall I try this one? I think that works. Well, I might just focus it on self-harm, if I might, because that's something I'm particularly interested in. And we hear a lot about the risks of the online world in terms of young people being exposed to self-harm content and how that makes them think about self-harm and whether that increases their risks of self-harm. And There is part of the suicide prevention strategy for England, which says very clearly that we have to put pressure on online media organisations to really regulate what young people, and indeed all of us, are exposed to. But I think we also need to recognise that the online world is a source of really, really valuable support for people who self-harm. And we did a piece of work that we, here at UCL, we were commissioned by Samaritans, and they wanted to know what is out there online for people who self-harm. And we were struck by the range of online forums that people could join and get really good peer support from people about self-harm and about how to self-harm in a way that is safe. And that means in a way that helps people cope with really, really distressing things in their lives, but in a way that was safe. And there was a lot of support in that community. There was a lot of awareness of the potential risks of being part of that community. And we know that there are risks of competitive self-harm sometimes in the online world, but there was a lot of support there. So I think if you are a young person who is self-harming to cope with distress or thinking about self-harm, then you not only have the support of mental health professionals, even if you may have to wait for it, and Georgina alluded to that, but you also have support from peers online, and it's worth looking carefully at good quality support available there.
Thank you. And Georgina, I'm going to come back to you on this as well, because I think the area that you have special knowledge of is also an area that's pretty hot online. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Alexandra has already said. I think I'm involved in an organisation called the Body Dysmorphic Disorder Foundation, which is a charity that helps people living with BDD, and they have a very active online support forum. And one of the things that we hear there is that people with BDD, particularly like DLD and many other conditions we've already mentioned, is so under-recognised that people feel so alone with it, and going on these online forums can be hugely powerful because it's a way of connecting with other people, knowing that they're not alone, sometimes hearing stories of hope, of recovery and treatment. And so I think it can be a real lifeline for some people. But yeah, of course, there is the potential concern of people sharing unhelpful information or experiences that are sort of just very disappointing and disheartening and can undermine somebody's motivation to seek help or their kind of expectation of getting better themselves, which is obviously is not a good thing. So I think it's just really important that these forums are well regulated and that they're done in the right way.
So I think I agree, important to strike that balance. There is value in having that online community, but better regulation would help make sure that people are getting appropriate information and can seek appropriate support where they need it. Susie, I'd love it if you asked your question now.
DLD is one of the most common, lifelong, pervasive disabilities that exists, but hardly anyone, even many mental health professionals or SEN experts, have heard of it. Why is this? What are the barriers to raising awareness of lesser known conditions such as DLD within children's and young people's mental health?
Brilliant job. Essie, would you like to have a go at this, please?
I think we already alluded to this a little bit in that I think a lot of the awareness depends on advocacy. And if you're less able to communicate, it's harder to advocate. And often in families, both parents and children may be experiencing language difficulties. So I think this is one of the reasons why it has been a slow burner to get the awareness, despite the fact that we know that children with DLD are overrepresented in mental health services and justice services. I think there is also an issue in that a lot of the therapies we offer are very language-based. So a lot of the cognitive behavioral therapies are very reliant on language, and I think there needs to be development, not necessarily of the central sort of working components of the therapies, but how they are delivered, and also testing maybe some alternatives that might be better suited. So I think in some cases there may also be a perception that there's nothing to offer, and therefore people are not sort of looking further, as it were. But it's not a right state of affairs, and it's something that I know Courtney has worked very hard to change, and I've tried to support her in, and there are a number of other people who are interested in it. So I think the awareness is coming, but I think it's lagging behind the awareness for comparison to many other childhood mental health or kind of mental health related conditions.
Thank you so much. And Arjos, I'm going to put you on the spot. What's one thing that advocates like Susie and Rachel could do to get the attention of people working in mental health, to get them to think more about the diversity of needs and how we can better meet them?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think that different groups will respond to different pieces of information, if you see what I mean. So there will be policymakers who I think will really want to see the lived examples and understand what it is, and hear the human stories behind it, and see that lots of their constituents and people they are meant to serve will, have these issues. And often this is something just simply do not know. So this is very valuable information. For practitioners, very often, practitioners tend to be pragmatic. So they want to know that if they identify something, what they identify is also something they can do something about. The do something about could be anything from telling school to do something differently, for example, which is quite a simple but very effective intervention, down to, oh, you can prescribe medication for something. Right? So stressing the malleability, the ability to change and improve something will have a lot of currency with people who kind of work frontline, as it were. And they're more likely to understand, oh my God, no, I hadn't noticed that. How is a child supposed to do, as you were saying, cognitive and behavioral therapy, which is very language heavy in some cases at least, if they have this problem? Well, it's an obvious reason for me to recognize it, right? And then for researchers, as ever, having good evidence of all these things helps quite a lot. So I think all that is there, but doing a concerted campaign with these things would be quite helpful. Tip: start early. Tell medical students about it. Tell psychiatric trainees about it. We learn little about it during training. So when you train in psychiatry, it's maybe you have one afternoon, right, whereas you have 20 devoted to autism, 50 devoted to depression. So I'm just taking the example of DLD, right? So if you want to have change, you need to start very early. So it's a generational thing, if you see what I'm saying. Does that make sense?
That's brilliant. And
Money talks. So if you can make a case to politicians that by intervening early, you save money, that is also powerful. And I think there's a very strong case there, given, for instance, juvenile justice system.
I think those are all really helpful points, and I totally agree about training. We're working on that. And if there are any teachers, I suspect you probably didn't hear much about DLD in your training either, and that is another area that we're really thinking about. So making environments more inclusive might help. Thank you. Juliet, would you like to ask the last question in this section, please?
Yeah, so this was kind of touched on earlier, but I'd like to know a bit more about it. Is there any research on whether learning about a mental health condition makes someone more likely to experience that condition? So I think this is particularly interesting to Alexandra, because I know about your research into suicidal ideation and self-harm, and I think this is something that's extremely problematic in this area. Learning about self-harm, does that make someone more likely to engage in it?
Thank you for that question. We were chatting just beforehand about a study that we did here at UCL where we wondered whether if you knew someone who self-harmed, so someone in your social network, but you yourself didn't self-harm, whether that had an impact on you as a young person, whether it made you more likely to self-harm. So we did an experiment in which we kind of simulated somebody learning that a friend of theirs was self-harming in response to something difficult that was going on in their life. And we measured their urges to self-harm before and after they had been exposed to this. It was basically a story of a friend of theirs who had self-harmed because they were struggling with a problem in their lives. And we found that their scores on urges to self-harm did increase after they'd been exposed to this story about their friend self-harming. So it was quite an artificial experiment, but it showed that their scores significantly changed. And then when we showed them a story of their friend using an app to cope with something that was difficult in their lives, their scores returned back to normal. So we could see that they were very, very responsive to the way their friends were behaving in terms of how they were solving problems. So if their friends were solving problems by self-harming, it made them more likely to do the same. And if their friends were using other ways of problem solving, then they would be more likely to emulate those ways of problem solving. So it was really extraordinary, this finding, because it made us realize that if you do have a friend who self-harms, it can have quite a big impact on you. And it just highlighted how important it is for young people to have a really good set of problem solving techniques they can use for when they encounter a problem in their lives, which makes them and their friends less likely to use self-harm to cope with that.
That's a really fascinating study and really thought-provoking in how we can support young people to think of alternatives to things that are harmful. Thank you. So we're going to move on to a different set of questions now, which are about how we support children, young people, their families, and their friends. As Alexandra mentioned, you know, your social network is really important, and we can recruit people within that network to support our young people. So Tilly, you've got a question now in this section. Would you be happy to ask it?
Yeah, my question was, current waiting times for mental health services for like children and young people are really long at the moment. Do you have any solutions that you would like suggest for children and young people that are waiting to access help or can't access it at all?
Argyris, can you solve the world's problem for us tonight?
Thank you. It's an excellent question, of course, but no, I don't have the answer to that. I think that there are a number of levels one has to think about it. So an obvious answer is, you know, you might need bigger services, right? So you might need to fund more services. That's always something that people will ask for. Whether that's feasible in the current economic climate and all that is a different question. The next one is whether you can create efficiencies, right? That means make things be a bit more efficient. So this can involve a number of things. It can be the question that we were talking about before. If I could accurately predict who needs treatment the most, then I would prioritize them, right? The problem is, though, in our field and in other fields of medicine as well, it's not just in psychiatry, but it's a particular problem here. It is very hard to know whom one should prioritize. Okay, so that is an issue. The next question is, could we become more efficient if we had several layers, several tiers of interventions? By interventions, I mean treatments, right? So we're talking about online treatments before. If I offered an online treatment to 1,000 people, which is easy to do, because online is just generally easy, you don't need necessarily a human being, at least in most of the scenarios. Could I have prevented some people from falling ill? Could I have prevented them, therefore, from coming into services? Does that make sense? I would have become more efficient. I would have improved the general public's health, and therefore fewer people would need the services, right? Then it is also a question of what types of treatments do we provide once people are in the system. And at the moment, we have a very reactive system. We're a crisis service, essentially. So we have someone who has severe anxiety. We might not see them because they're not self-harming, if that makes sense, right? But when someone has come to the point of severe self-harm that brings them into hospital, right, and has all sorts of other social problems around, it may be harder to make a difference, it may be harder to make a change. I don't want to be pessimistic, but it just may be harder than if you had caught them a little bit before them. So the way that services work at the moment is very reactive. They prioritize perceived risk over, efficiency and efficacy of the treatment. So it's a complex answer. There's several levels to it. But overall, the message to politicians should also be: how much do you spend on health as a percentage of your overall, gross domestic national product? So your per GDP. We're on the lower side in Britain at the moment, still. And haven't renewed several things for a number of years. There are big systemic issues as well.
Yeah, but I think, and the thing that you touched on, which I think is absolutely important, is to get more creative with prevention and not just leave it until somebody actually needs to be hospitalized.
On that line, Essie, I was going to go a bit off-piste and say, when kids are waiting to access help through the health service, they're in school. And schools are also chronically underfunded. And I just wondered if you could say something about what you think schools could do to support kids, while they're waiting to access help, or how they could be more part of that prevention agenda, given that they're also really strapped for resources.
Well, first of all, I don't think it is fundamentally, it's certainly not the school's job to be a mental health service.
No, I totally agree with
but,
that.
I think that, there's a lot of good evidence that something which scientists call social prescribing can be quite effective in preventing mental health problems. And this means making sure that young people are involved in various social and sort of leisure activities. And this is something that school clubs, if there are resources for them, can really provide. I also think that there could be an opportunity with NHS linking with the schools, and this is partly happening already with the education and mental health providers, to do what we would call indicated prevention. So you would be working with young people who already have some symptoms, but who have not yet escalated in their symptoms. And you can maybe then do some less intense therapeutic work with those young people, perhaps in a school setting, so it doesn't become a sort of game of logistics with parents getting children to certain places. The point when children are already at school and may be able to take part in activities that you could frame more as skill building rather than a mental health intervention. And we are running, there are members of my team in the audience tonight, we've been running a school-based indicated prevention trial, which we are just getting results in this spring, where we try to build emotional and social skills in a way that ought to prevent mental health problems. That's great.
I think that those findings will be absolutely fascinating. We'll look out for those. Evie, would you be happy to ask question 7?
So what challenges do families of children and young people with mental health issues face? And what strategies might help these families as well as children and young people?
Brilliant. So Georgina, I'm going to get you to answer that. What help do families need?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So I think when a young person's experiencing mental health problems, it's really important to think about the family context. If you think about where those mental health problems have come from, the risk factors that contribute are often ones that are often shared with the whole family. So there may be some genetic risk factors, there may be some environmental factors like social disadvantage or trauma, which other people in the family have experienced as well. And then, of course, living with somebody with a mental health problem is extremely upsetting and concerning and can impact on the whole family. So I think it's often the case that other people in the family system are struggling as well, not just the young person who comes to CAMHS. So I think it's important that we consider that in terms of what second part of the question is what can we do to help, I think, is that right? So I think in child and adolescent mental health services, we're quite good at thinking about the family as a whole and often include parents and siblings in treatment. So that's sort of one important component. But as we've heard, not everyone gets into child and adolescent health services, or if they do, it's often after long delays. So I think we also need to think more widely about what's sort of available, and I think some of the third sector organisations, the charities that we've touched on, can be really invaluable in this area. So organisations like the National Autistic Society or OCD Action, there's a whole range of them often run support groups for family members as well as for individuals who are experiencing mental health problems themselves. I think also knowing that there are sort of some good quality resources available, so sort of books that are written, for example, for parents with children who have mental health problems, can be really helpful to draw on. There's also quite a lot of self-help books and so on that are probably not that helpful, but I think being able to seek advice about the useful ones to use, either through charities or through child and adolescent mental health services, can be really valuable.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, Juliet, would you like to ask our next question, please?
Yeah, so this is a slightly different question, but it does feed into the idea of targeted prevention. So during a child's development, they learn self-regulation skills. How does the development of these self-regulation skills impact a child's susceptibility to addictive behaviours? So things like gaming and gambling, they're really big at the moment, but they're quite unregulated. How can we better support parents in managing these risks to prevent harmful effects as children develop self-regulation skills?
That's a really tricky one. And it's a tricky one because it's very, very hard to show a causal effect. So it may be that and in fact we have good data that shows that individuals who are more susceptible for genetic reasons to develop addictions are unsurprisingly the ones who are more likely to be attracted to particular, gambling or gaming or something like that, and are then more likely to also be hooked. So it's a very, I often use when I talk to students about addictions, I talk about if you have the sort of addictive genotype, if you like, saying no to various things is like saying no to the best piece of cake you've ever seen. And if you don't have those genes that put you at risk, it's like saying no to broccoli. It's not very hard, at least not for me, I don't like broccoli. So there are these very complex issues about not everyone has the equal risk, and therefore the managing of the risk is very different, and also managing the sort of development of the self-regulatory skills is very different. And I think most parents who have more than one child will recognize that one of them is probably better regulated than the other, unless you were very lucky and have two super regulated children. So you end up using very different strategies to try and help them sort of make good choices. So it's a really, really complex system. Argus, you may want to add a
No, I think this is exactly right. Unsurprisingly, not having certain things available, helps quite a lot. Right? So if you grow up in a society where there are no hard drugs, probably it's just helpful. Or, where gambling is not readily available. So those things kind of working on the supply side, cutting down the supply of those things can be quite helpful. The other thing is, surprisingly, so there's kind of, if you think about interventions, like treatments and prevention stuff, you can think about it in a number of ways. One way to think creatively about it is you go to the individuals and tell them, do this, don't do that. That doesn't help a lot, as we know, right? There are some tweaks you can do, and then it can work. Another thing, though, that I want to point out is peer networks, because those can be quite potent. What your friends do and don't do, what is cool to do and uncool to do, can have a big impact, even on addictive behaviors. And some of the best interventions that we have work at the level, seem to be working at least, at the level of kind of networks of young people. So this is quite important to remember when you target, when you do messaging about things, you're targeting groups of people.
Can I add a little bit? I think that's just reminded me, there's some very nice research into addictions by a scientist called Patricia Conrad, who works in Canada. And she works both at the level of the individual and at the kind of the level of the peers. And she's shown that if you do interventions that match someone's kind of personality profile, so people get addicted for different reasons. Some get addicted because they manage their anxiety with drugs or gaming or something. Some get addicted because they're sensations. Now, the strategies you would use to try and manage those behaviors are different depending on the reason for the behaviors. What's interesting is if you do the interventions and match them to someone's vulnerabilities, you catch the children who are more likely to get addicted. And as a result, their peers are less likely to get addicted because they are often people who are sort of doing those things. There's someone in the audience here, Jack Andrews, who was very interested in research into social influence in adolescents and has shown that actually for adolescents, losing kind of social credibility is a huge risk factor. So you're pitting these health risks against the risk of losing popularity. Yes. So it's more of a risk to lose the peer popularity of them than it is to do some of these other risk behaviors, and that's kind of important to think about.
Maybe interesting to take smoking as an example. Right? Again, something where you might need to be a bit older to remember how smoking was. It's not that long ago that people might have been smoking in this very room.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Thank you. I'm going to take chair's privilege to ask the next question of Alexandra. And one thing that we wanted to acknowledge is that we don't have any boys on our youth panel. That's not for the want of trying. We did try to get some boys on the panel, but they were less keen on sitting up at the front.
I have a dual role.
Well, young boys, shall we say. Anyway, I'm delighted to see some boys in the audience, and I didn't want you to think that we'd forgotten about you. But I wanted to ask Alexandra, do you see sex differences in presentation of mental health, and particularly in loneliness and how that feeds into mental health or mental distress?
Well, there are so many different ways of measuring loneliness, and I don't think that we've quite got it right. But it seems that loneliness is reported more commonly by women. I don't think we've got good enough measurements in young people to know if there are gender differences. And I think it's important to say that loneliness is something that we all experience at certain points in our lives and is completely normal. So if you start in a new university or you start in a new school, it's completely normal to feel lonely because you just haven't developed those satisfying social relationships yet. And it's only when you start to settle in that you feel comfortable with the people around you. But if you don't, then that very transient loneliness can develop into something which is potentially quite harmful to your mental health, and that we describe as chronic loneliness. Now, people talk a lot about a loneliness epidemic in the UK, and certainly in America, the Surgeon General there has talked about a loneliness epidemic. And I think that's quite misleading because there's not good evidence to show that the prevalence or the proportion of the population who feel lonely has risen that much. And indeed, in some groups, it's fallen. The other thing to say is that loneliness used to be very stigmatizing, particularly in young people. And, you know, the popular conception is of one's youth as a time when you have all these social relationships and you're supposed to be really well connected. But many young people feel really, really quite lonely, chronically lonely. And that's quite embarrassing to admit. And I think what was potentially one positive thing about the COVID pandemic was that so many people were talking about their isolation and their loneliness that actually it wasn't stigmatizing to tell people that you felt lonely. And I think that's been really positive because it means that people are coming forward and telling people that they feel lonely and doing something about it and recognizing that it could be quite harmful to their mental health because there are so many people now working on this topic. So I don't think I've been very clear about gender differences, but I hope.
Alexa, can I because you keep hearing about young boys being at risk of suicide and this being a realism, and I know that's your area of expertise, and I know that this is something that parents of some adolescent boys really worry about, self-harm and suicide. Do you have anything, any research on that or know about it?
I mean, the first thing to say is that the suicide rate in young people is much lower than it is in people in their middle age or older years. But obviously it's something we really, really worry about. And I think that for many young people, and this goes back to the question about destigmatizing mental health problems, feeling suicidal is incredibly shaming for many people. And imagine if you had to tell a friend of yours, no matter how old you are, that you are feeling suicidal. There's a lot of anxiety there about that, how that person is going to react to you. And if you do that you pluck up the courage for the first time in your life to tell somebody that you're feeling suicidal and they don't want to talk about it and they move the subject on, you're probably never going to bring up that topic again. And now put yourself in the shoes of a 15-year-old boy having to tell his friends or his parents that he's feeling suicidal. There's so much risk there for that person in the reaction they might get from the people around them. And I think that because that stigma is felt so strongly by young boys, particularly because they're less likely to talk to their friends than young women are, then they might be more likely to bottle their feelings up and to escape from the distress they feel by attempting suicide. And that might be an explanation, but we don't really know. So I think the message to all of us here as citizens is if anybody says to you that they are struggling with suicidal thoughts, show an openness to talk about it. And if you don't feel comfortable, and even us mental health professionals sometimes feel worried about how we might respond to someone who feels suicidal, but always show that you know where that person can seek help so that you're not shutting down the conversation and showing them that there is help available for them.
That's a really important message. Thank you. In the interest of time is going so quickly, I'm going to skip question 10 and we're going to come on to questions about neurodivergence. And just to set the scene, I'm a speech and language therapist and have a growing interest in mental health, trying to understand how services are set up for neurodivergent youth is a real puzzle to me. So if you want to get a diagnosis of autism and ADHD, you can find out how to do it, but that comes under the mental health services. So what is the relationship between neurodivergence and mental health? And why is there such a huge focus on autism and ADHD? Argyris, do you have some thoughts on this?
Why there is such a focus, is that?
Well, more like, why are they under mental health? Is the assumption that this is a mental health disorder, or is it an assumption that neurodivergent youth are at very high risk of mental health, or why is it set up that way? And is it the most sensible thing to do?
Yeah, so I should say that I want to be very clear about this. This is a bit of a conceptual, philosophical point, but I think it has great practical relevance. I don't think that whether something is called a disorder or not, I don't think that is in and of itself a scientific question. I mean, it's not a question that science can answer. It is a question that society answers. Psychiatry has lots of such examples. You know, once upon a time, homosexuality used to be a disorder, right? It is no longer. That's not because the science changed. Well, the science did change, but it's not a scientific reason, it's a societal reason why it's changed. The same thing with what people decide to call a disorder or not. Science can inform these debates, but it's not deciding them, because these are value questions. So, many people abhor the idea that they have a disorder, right? And they will want to call the characteristics that they identify in themselves or others as not being a disorder, right? And whether society will accept it or not is a question for society and for debate. It's a value question, right? People will then say, well, what about the genetics though, and things like that? Well, the fact that the behavior is encoded genetically doesn't make it necessarily a disorder, if you see what I mean. So again, this is not a good argument to call something a disorder or not. Now, it becomes a bit more complicated because we say that the public should pay money for services because of what used to be called years back, the people who suffer undeservedly. We don't say that anymore. We say someone is ill, that person deserves our help. Right? And we as taxpayers would say, or as individuals would say, we want to fund that, we want to help that and create services for that. It then becomes a bit more difficult to explain to the public and to people why you would fund something which is not a disorder, where people are not necessarily in need, but it's just because of the difference. So these are just, again, value rather than science questions necessarily. And how a society tackles them says a lot about society, the society we live in. So I'm not going to be drawn into the debate whether there should be disorders or not, but I will say something from the point of view of the clinician. In these value debates, I hope that those who contribute their voices, who say and have a say about these things, also come from those people who suffer the most from the consequences of these problems, and also come from the ranks of those people who have benefited from the treatment that is available for these problems, right? Because it's very important. Like, I have seen people with, and I'm getting into anecdote now, but I as a clinician have seen families who have been devastated by, for example, ADHD, young lives have been devastated by ADHD, and people who got a lot better by taking, for example, medication. Yep. So I do hope that these people who often don't have a voice will be represented, right? Yep. Does that make sense? Or families who have children with autism spectrum disorder, and they say, well, the children are non-verbal and have great learning difficulties. They're often underrepresented in those value debates that we have concerning the status of disorder, if that makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense. There is a diversity of experience, and all experiences are of equal value, and how we organize our services should take account of all those different points of view. I do think there is research about the relationship between neurodiversity and mental health. So I wonder if somebody could say something around that.
I can say a little bit. So we do know that there are increased rates of mental health problems in individuals with neurodiversity, at least those who go beyond some diagnostic threshold. And that's perhaps not surprising, because these are individuals who have challenges, often in social and educational domains, and those challenges then come with ongoing stress. And we know from etiologically informative research, so this is research that looks at both genetic and environmental causes of presentation, that many of the things neurodevelopmentally that are risk factors for neurodiversity are also risk factors for mental health problems. I mean, brain doesn't have like specific pathways, that this is the ADHD pathway and that's the only thing that it does. You have neurodevelopment is a very complex thing, and when one thing goes wrong, a number of other things are likely to go wrong, and some of these are sort of consequences that have knock-on effects, which can result in different presentations over development. So, I mean, I don't know if that's
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a nice segue into Rachel's question, because we know that neurodivergent youth are at increased risk for mental health, but we don't seem to have a very good solution to how to support that, although, as Arjira says, clearly for some families that support has been fundamental and really, really improved lives. So Rachel, do you want to ask your question?
So why is CBT still considered the default treatment for everyone? Given that we know a high percentage of service users have speech, language and communication needs, why are researchers not specifically researching interventions for this cohort? For example, could drama or art therapy be more effective for these groups?
Thank you. Georgina, do you want to have a go?
That's a really great question. As you say, if you come to a child and adolescent mental health service, the chances are you're going to be offered a talking therapy. And what if you have a communication difficulty? Is that going to be effective? I think The answer is that health services are quite pragmatic, and the evidence base, so the research that we have at the moment, most strongly supports cognitive behaviour therapy as opposed to other forms of psychological therapy like art therapy or drama therapy for many of the common mental health problems, not necessarily for all, but for many. So for example, anxiety. We know that about 80% of young people will get better with cognitive behaviour therapy for anxiety if it's delivered in the optimal way. So I guess there's a question, do we need to look for other therapies for young people who have communication problems, or do we need to think about how we deliver CBT in a way that's better suited? It may be both, because even if we deliver it in the best way possible, probably not everyone will respond, so we need to consider other approaches too. But I think we can probably get quite far with adaptations, and that's work that Courtney and others are doing at the moment, thinking about how can we take the core ingredients from cognitive behaviour therapy and make it more accessible to people with to neurodivergent individuals, particularly individuals with developmental language disorders. So that might mean relying more on visual materials and less on talking. It might mean better integrating parents into treatment. In fact, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, NICE, has guidance on how CBT should be adapted for children with autism. I don't think we yet have the equivalent for DLD, but I think, moving in that direction could be really helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. We are just about at time for the panel questions. So I wonder if we could give a big round of applause to our 4 young panelists for their excellent questions and being brave to ask them. But if you're willing to stay, we're going to have some questions from the audience, and you might have some thoughts about these questions, because they're quite interesting questions. And of course, quite a few questions are coming up about online presence, social media, gaming. So I'm going to take 2 quite provocative questions. And the first one is, what is the impact of online gaming, so things like Minecraft, Roblox, Fortnite, on behavior and needs of teenagers? Do we have any research on that? No? We're too old for gaming, we don't know.
Very succinct summary, and then others can pick up. The succinct summary is that the evidence is mixed. It probably depends on what games you play, for how long, and who's doing the gaming. So it can be extremely good for some people, and they can connect with other people, and it can be good fun, it can be something that's a lovely way of relaxing, and for other people it can be something that takes over their life and basically is not done in a healthy way. So there is not a straightforward answer. I don't think any self-respecting scientist would write off either gaming or social media. I think they're here to stay. We've got to live with them. Even as adults, none of us would give up our phones. It's more about how to use them in a healthy way.
And that's an interesting point, because the next question, and I'm going to ask the young people to answer this one, is what do you think of Australia's ban for under 16-year-olds on using social media? So in Australia, they've banned under 16-year-olds from accessing social media in the hopes that this will improve mental health. And I just wonder what you would think about that if you couldn't get on Snapchat or TikTok or WhatsApp or whatever it is that young people do. Julia is desperate to tell us what she thinks of that.
Okay. Well, that question kind of has many different aspects. First off is, would that actually be effective? I'm not going to get into that, but I mean, there are bans on social media platforms already, and there aren't any that's not enforced.
Yeah.
And I think that is really dangerous. children as young as like 8 years old having phones, and being exposed to, particularly, I think it was kind of touched on earlier, FOMO is a really big thing at the moment. This disparity between these feelings of loneliness and these feelings of depression, and then the idea of like youth being your golden years, I guess, and it's the age of innocence, and when you get older, like partying and meeting up with friends, and there's a sort of shame around that.
So you're not a fan of this idea?
No, I just think that it's going to be really hard to enforce that, but it is also really important. Then leading on from that, I think there is an aspect of social media actually being really useful, particularly in a mental health space. I know that I've been helped by mental health platforms. I know that there are social media, well, not really influencers, because that term's a little bit diluted. But there are people on social media who are really helpful. And in a time where the NHS is really oversubscribed, and you have such long waiting lists for things like, well, CAMS in particular, but also I'm thinking particularly like eating disorder services. There is a lot of help online, and you don't see that. You don't get that from clinicians. So I think it's really important, social media as a platform, to raise awareness of mental health difficulties. So yes, it has its demons. It has this competitive self-harm element. It has this FOMO element, but it also has this element of raising awareness and building a community.
Can I ask you a question? So I've got we've got a colleague here at UCL who's done some very interesting research that shows that people can kind of spiral in a good way or in a bad way in social media, partly depending on kind of the choices they make when they engage with it. The colleague is called Tali Sharad, and she has suggested that social media content should come with the same kind of labels that our food comes, sort of almost like the equivalent of nutrition labels. And I'm also thinking, when you have content and advice, some of that advice may be very good and evidence-based, but some of it may actually be harmful. And how are young people to know who's an expert to trust and who's not? So what do you as a young person think of the idea that if there would be some sort of almost like badges or labels in sites that you would you find it helpful if there was sort of, this is likely to be good for you, and or this is a verified advice? Do you think that would be something that could be helpful and could make that space safer without the kind of prosecutor ban that we maybe can't really police?
I've got a microphone, I guess I could answer this. Talking about the nutrition labels, there is a kind of idea of trigger warnings, and that's rising in popularity, and people are using that a lot more. But I think if you're in that negative spiral, you're going to search for that content that is going to trigger you. And so it's on creators, and also on social media platforms, but they don't do a huge amount because it's a profit-based algorithm. I think it's on creators to not put dangerous content out there, to not put the content out there that's going to have those red labels on it. It's on people, it's on users of the platform, it's on people who are older than 16 to look after the people who might be going against these bans, who might be really young, because you don't know who could see your content. You don't know who could be out there. So if there is something that's going to be labeled as red, that shouldn't exist in the first place. If we have a social responsibility to not put that out there.
That's a really helpful perspective. Thank you. Would any of the other young people like to say something about social media?
I think just adding on to that point, the issue stems not from social media itself, but more from lack of regulation in social media. Like you said, it's more on the creator rather than the actual like companies that are making these apps themselves to protect you maybe younger users from the harmful content. And I think a complete ban on social media maybe isn't the correct way to go. A lot of days now in more modern times, there's not as many safe or affordable spaces for younger people to go and socialize. And I think social media allows that to be the kind of other option for young people. But because of the lack of regulation on these spaces, it also has the added dangers of being able to find whatever you can that you might not be able to find in the real world as such.
That's a really, really good point. Creating safe spaces generally for young people is something that might also get at this idea of loneliness. Evie or Susie, do you want to say anything about social media? You don't have to. No? Okay, we'll go on, and if you have an idea, you can raise your hand. There's quite a few questions that are thinking about other underrepresented groups. So we've talked about neurodivergent youth, but there are some questions about risk for mental health in the LGBTQ plus community, and in children who are from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds and young people from BAME backgrounds. So, Alexandra, would you like to say something about those risk groups and what we know about risk for mental health and what supports those young people?
Yeah, at UCL we've been doing quite a lot of research in the mental health of people from sexual minority groups and gender minority groups, and it's really clear that they have an increased risk of self-harm, of suicidal thoughts and suicide attempt. And of course, what we want to know is why is that? And one of the PhD students at UCL called Talon Wright did a really interesting study where she looked at something called microaggressions in people who identify as transgender. And she did a study where she surveyed people across the UK. They weren't all young people, but she wanted to find out about their experiences of microaggressions. So these are day-to-day slights, if you like, where people might say, oh, you're being too sensitive. I got your pronouns wrong. It's not a big issue. But of course, people experience this day after day after day, and this just mounts up. And we found that people who experience more microaggressions related to their gender identity were more likely to feel suicidal. And so we can see that we can't trivialize the way we other people from sexual or gender minority groups, because that can contribute to them feeling so desperate that they want to escape a society that treats them like that. So I think it's really important to do more research to understand why people feel suicidal, but that was one thing that we investigated, and I think it's something that we can all do something about.
Brilliant. Would anyone else on the panel like to talk about inequalities and how we're addressing those in research and in our practice? Go on, Georgina.
I was just going to add, as well as thinking about whether certain groups, minoritized groups, might be at increased risk for developing mental health problems, we should also think about access to services. And there's good data to show that individuals from minoritized groups, for example, ethnic minority groups, often struggle to access services. And the reasons for that is complex, multi-level. It might be partly to do with cultural beliefs and stigma and so on, but it may also be biases in the system and who's referred. And there's some really good work in that space and initiatives that have been put in place to overcome some of these obstacles with really quite encouraging effects.
Brilliant.
It may sound like a socialist point to make, but income inequalities have arisen over the years, and they're an elephant in the room. And they seem to have great consequences, and quite likely causal consequences. And they are kind of society level things that we can change about them. I mean, if you think about the fact that it's quite staggering actually that there are children who don't have food when they go to school. They don't have enough food. It's very hard to imagine. And it is there. So, it is something that's can change, needs to change, and it's very, so to speak, actionable.
Excellent, excellent points. Okay, one of the top rated questions is one I'm also going to put to the young people. And what are your thoughts on academic pressure and how that feeds into the ways that you might be feeling? So do you think that the academic pressure is manageable, and what would you do to, or what would you want to say to schools or the government about the way we assess our kids or the pressure that you feel? What would you want to say to Keir Starmer or the Secretary of State for Education about school pressure? Edie, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I just feel like at schools there's obviously a lot of pressure to do well, and I think that can cause quite a negative mindset in a lot of people, because the idea, oh, I didn't do well on this test, I don't feel like that's giving me a lot of, like, I don't feel great about myself now, because now I think that everyone thinks that I can't pass my test and everything. And I think that like promotes like feelings of like low like self-esteem, and I think that's like great to promote in young people.
Does that sound like a familiar experience to all of you? Yeah. Yeah. Susie, what do you think about exams?
Yeah.
Yeah. Panel, what can we do to reduce this insane amount of pressure we're putting our kids under?
I would radically suggest to scrap GCSEs. I don't think anyone needs to be doing high-stakes exams at the age of 16.
No.
I come from Finland, where we don't do that, and I've done okay academically. I think that would be my suggestion.
Yeah. Oh, lots of support for that idea. Alexandra, did you want to add to that?
Well, I guess there are things that the education system can do, but we can never take stress out of life. There's always going to be some challenge,
Yes.
and I guess we need to think about people's coping strategies, because really horrendous things happen to you over the course of your life. You lose friends, people drift off, you move house, your parents separate. You have to be able to cope with all these things that crop up in your life. And I think if we can equip kids with a good set of coping strategies that allow them to adapt to these things when they do happen, then they are more likely to be able to cope with whatever new assessment system the government creates, or difficulties within their social networks, within their families. And I guess the more we can do to equip the kids with that, the more they can cope with across the board. We've talked about so many challenges today.
And I think that's a great point, because this is something schools can do, right? Build up kids' self-esteem and their resilience, make them realize what they're good at and how they can deal successfully with these challenges would be a great thing for schools to focus on. And Rachel wants to add to that. Go on, Rachel.
I just feel that at the moment, mainstream school is just about testing memory more than anything else. If you've got a brilliant memory, you can do really well and get, 11 GCSEs at A star. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're resilient or interesting, or you've got initiative or you're creative. So I feel that the education system needs to be broadened out again, like it actually used to be, to take account of everybody's strengths and everybody's passions and everybody's interests, and not just reading, writing and maths,
I think that's an excellent point that most of us could get behind, definitely.
And I think that in and of itself would partly serve to
That preventative.
people to sort of deal with whatever life throws at them.
I think, hang on, Tilly wants to say something.
Sorry, if I could add to the original point, I think like it kind of relies a lot on, I think it's called standardized testings. I think it relies a lot on more testing once every few months. It's a lot of pressure all of a sudden. I've started my GCSEs recently, and the pressure really builds up because all of a sudden you've got to remember all of these things. And I think, like you were saying, the lack of kind of choice for example, if you wanted to do maybe a more creative thing like a DT or art or drama, there's really a lack of options for young people at the time. And I think if you broaden that, it would kind of reduce the stress in that environment.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Okay, so the next question is quite an important one. So we have a lot of very supportive parents in the audience today and really great advocates for their kids. Unfortunately, not all young people have that. I wonder if the panel could give some really concrete suggestions for young people who may feel less supported at home. How can they get help? What should they do if they feel that they're really struggling, but their parents, for whatever reason, aren't able to take that on board and help them?
I think I would encourage any young person like that to check out what's on offer in terms of youth work in their area. Youth workers often advocate and help young people who may not have support at home. Obviously, finding teachers who you may gel with and who can support you, also very important. Having peers, maybe peers who have families where you can be part of their family life every now and again. It's not great. I mean, it would be ideal if everyone could go home and they could have the support of the family. And it's obviously also rough if you have to be looking for that support rather than the adult looking to support you. But I would encourage, get involved in different clubs. If drama is your thing, do that. If sports is your thing, do that. And find adults who are invested in your development and basically seek some of the help that should be coming from those adults, and also good peers who have your best interests at heart.
Alexandra, would you add anything to that, or?
I think it's a great list that Essie just gave, and finding your mentor somewhere amongst all those choices, someone you admire and can give you some guidance that you feel you're lacking.
Brilliant. Trusted adults and good friends, and for all the young people in the audience, be a good friend and help listen and be an advocate for your friends if they need it. We're coming to the end of time. I'm going to let our young people have the last word. So you have some of the best researchers in the country on the same table as you, asking really important questions about how we can improve children and young people's mental health. What one thing would you want them to look at? What research would be helpful to you? Okay, what would you want them to do? Who wants to go first? I think Juliet's been thinking about this. I can see the smile on her face. Juliet, do you want to start one piece of research that would be a game changer for you?
There was a question that arose earlier from one of the questions. This is a very hotly debated question, and there is research on it, but the link between neurodivergence and mental health difficulties has been proven to be a strong one. Do we think that is nature-based? Do we think that that's because neurodivergent brains are wired differently, and that wiring, I put wiring in quotation marks because obviously, anyway, is it that wiring that leads to the faulty neural mechanisms and that faulty way of thinking that predisposes the individual to mental health difficulties? Or is it growing up in a society that isn't made for them, and the high levels of bullying that children are exposed to and that feeling of being alien? Is it a combination of both? I guess it's a question of nature or nurture, and that's something that I'd be interested in hearing about.
Age-old question, likely to be both, but trying to work out what the balance is would be a really, really useful thing to do. Thank you for that question. Susie, I think I can guess what your question might be, but do you have a question about research? What research could we do?
I think what is important for Susie is it's very hard if you've got a language disorder at school, at
primary school, secondary school, learning setting, because you can't speak up and you.
Sorry, could you use your microphone? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. You can't speak up. Like you have often situational mutism in groups of peers. You can't even follow the peers' conversation. You go home, the radio's on, you can't follow the radio. If you watch TV, you have to completely pause it every 30 seconds and ask what's happening because it's too fast. So I think for Susie, it would be just more awareness because there's so many young people and adults out there with this problem, and it's so disabling, so isolating, and there's so little support. And all the things that you've been discussing, we're living it. We are absolutely desperately trying to get help for Susie's mental health, have been for years, can't get anything.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, it seems impossible. So yeah, that's probably what.
We want to make it more possible. And I think this links to Juliet's question and this idea of, can we shift the focus from managing crisis to making situations better so we can prevent those negative feelings?
It's about inclusivity.
Yes.
You know, in every way.
Yeah.
Make things accessible for everybody and inclusive.
Yeah, we've got our work cut out. So that's a great research question. How can we do that better? Evie, do you have a research question? What would you most like to find out?
I'm not really sure.
Not sure. We can come back to you in a minute if you like. Tilly.
I'm also not entirely sure. I can't really come up with something straight away, sorry.
Okay, no worries, no worries. I think maybe we'll think about whether getting rid of GCSEs leads to a improvement in children and young people's mental health. So thank you so much, everyone. There are going to be some refreshments in the foyer. Stay, talk to each other, meet each other, and make some connections. Can I thank everyone on the panel today? Essie, Georgina, Argyris, Alexandra, Tilly, Juliet, Evie, Susie, and Rachel. Memorize everyone.